And we will.
Okay. All right. Let me know when you're ready.
Yeah, we'll go.
All right. My apologies for the technical difficulties. Leave it to my Mac here to argue the point. My name's Daniel. My talk's a little bit different than what most of this has been this weekend. My talk is actually on, at first, the inadvertent denial of service on the 911 system. I know that sounds kind of strange, but early in my career, I actually started out in fire and EMS, and I often wondered what would happen if you increased the call volume on a limited supply when it came to somebody answering the other line when you needed it. 911 centers only have a limited amount of lines coming into the center. As weird as that sounds, often these centers only have anywhere between 6 to 10 lines and can very quickly be overwhelmed. At that point, there are two options. When you call 911 and the center no longer has any lines, it actually rolls to the next closest center, which could be 3 miles down the road, it could be 10 miles down the road, and in some cases, it could be a whole state away. That's been a unique challenge to, especially with the advent of cell phones. I know that sounds kind of antiquated, but take, for example, a WV football game. If you had 6,000 people all of a sudden call 911, you're going to have 911 centers in New York City answering the call. Because it overloads the lines and actually just cascades to the point where they're the first person that was actually able to pick up the phone. So, the other point to this that kind of relates more along the lines of security is that how many of you guys own a home security system? When that security system goes off, the dispatch center or the alarm monitoring picks up the phone and calls the 911 center that you're registered to. What happens if they can't get through? Then that alarm goes nowhere. They can sit and call all they want, but the direct line's not going to answer. It's going to roll to another location. So effectively, you've mitigated any help that would be coming to answer that alarm. So just a little bit that kind of got me started on this. In March 8th of this year, there was a bug in a T-Mobile lines in Houston, Texas. Actually, correction, Dallas. My apologies. It actually caused the cell phones in the area to ghost call 911 repeatedly. Long story short, what started out as maybe 15 calls ended up being over 1,000 calls within 5 minutes. The phones would actually call, hang up, call, hang up, call, hang up, and every time that call would be placed, it held a line. There were call wait times up to 40, 45 minutes. The average wait time was 38 minutes for somebody to even pick up the phone. Now, a lot of times they would pick up the phone and say, 911, please hold, and they would be on hold. It doesn't matter what event it is. They were waiting until they got a chance to answer that call. And what caused that problem is that dispatchers are required by federal law to call back every single hang-up call that comes in. So if you've got a phone that's calling 60 times in a 20-minute period, they're going to call back 60 times to ascertain whether or not there was an emergency. At that point in stage, any incoming calls have to be placed on hold. This happened multiple times in Dallas area. A little bit earlier, in November of 2016, there was an iPhone bug that was actually exploited through a tweet. It was intended to drive pop-ups on the phone, but what actually happened in Arizona was when they clicked on the tweet, it actually put the phone into a loop that would call and hang up 911 and lock the phone up. So users were not actually able to end the call. So you'd be sitting there looking at your phone, it would hang up, call, but the screen was non-responsive. It just got to the point where some people were able to hard reset the phones, or it actually effectively went dead. You had a 911 center that had 6 people on duty, and at one point in time had over 2,000 calls in a 10, 20-minute period. Another side of this is also, it's not just cell phones. In April 8th, Yeah, also in Dallas, poor Dallas. All 156 sirens were hacked and set off between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. repeatedly. Those sirens were designed in the event of a terrorist attack, national weather issue such as tornadoes. It caused sheer panic, and by proxy, 911 calls went up over 1,000%, trying to figure out what was going on. This happened for several hours before they got it stopped. Again, you think when you call 911, it shouldn't happen. Somebody should pick up the phone, and you should be able to get the help you're looking for. Again, 911 systems are built on a cascade. So if you think about that, long story short, if you have a small number of calls that stays in a localized area, the more calls you add, the bigger the impact zone is going to be. Another interesting part of this is that one of the things I personally didn't realize was that I thought that it only worked with 911 calls, that once it filled the 911 lines up, that it would roll to the next system, that there was still a line open that you could call in, like alarm companies can call, but that's not true. The way the system's built is that as it fills up, it will fill up every single line in that center before, including the non-emergency line, the direct line that alarm companies will call, that bank vaults, whenever there's a bank vault alarm, when the alarm company calls for that, that would be busy. They would have no way of dispatching police. So what's the big deal about a ghost call? You would think that once you figured it out, you just quit answering them, or you block them. Ghost calls, by definition, are a call that comes in and immediately hangs up. Again, by federal law, the phone number that shows up to the dispatcher, they have to put everything else on hold and actually call that person back and ask them if there's an emergency or what the story is. And by the time that they even hit the redial button, these things are happening so quick, there's 5 to 10, even up to 25 calls that can stack. And it can happen even inadvertently. Again, I reference like a WVU football game where you have 60,000 people in the stands. You have one stands call 911, you've wiped out Mon, Marion, Harrison, and Pittsburgh's answering 911 calls. Not to mention the cell tower was shut down. Hopefully that would be the first thing before it overwhelmed and caused widespread panic. So one of the other sides of this is that a DDoS like this actually does have a human cost. A lot of times you think of an attack like that being based directly on financial numbers. In Houston, when this happened, wait times led to the death of an infant after falling off the bed while the babysitter sat on hold. Babysitter sat on hold for 35 minutes. Kid fell off the bed, hit a dresser, and when he called 911 for an ambulance, he sat on hold for 35 minutes before somebody was able to answer the phone to tell him how to do CPR. In Dallas, the local news also reported a similar situation where the caller was on hold for 20 minutes while the guy's husband quit breathing. He actually called, he was still breathing and moving, but by the time the call was answered, he had died. So it's stories like this that kind of got me thinking, how much would it take to shut down a system? How many calls would it take? How many handsets would it take? What kind of system could even wipe out something that we take especially for granted? Well, I got my answer. It only takes 6,000 handsets to shut down a regional system. That's the entire Northeast. Barring how New York City and the larger metros handle it, you could shut down the entire state with less than 6,000. And that doesn't necessarily have to be active cell phones with a subscription. Any cell phone, whether it's active or not, has the ability to call 911. As long as it can register to the network, it is legally required to be able to dial 911. I mean, you could have 4,000 old cell phones plugged in and run them all at once and shut down the ability to call for help for several hundred miles. They also in the proof of concept showed that it will only take 200,000 handsets to substantially create wait times across the entire U.S. That's really not a lot of handsets when you think of population and the amount of people that are on their phones at any point in time. This can be achieved through a malicious app. I mean, we see stories all the time of fake apps, like a fake WhatsApp app making it to the Play Store, or some new fad app that gets downloaded everybody wants to run. And there are a lot of users out there that'll download it and say, oh, sure, allow all the permissions. Yeah, it wants to use your phone. Why does it want to use your phone? Why does it want to make calls? But there are a lot of people that don't read those, and you could very easily compromise 6,000 phones by a simple download. The tweet, it was proven in Arizona that it took a hyperlink run in the pseudo browser from the Twitter app for it to put the phone in a loop. Challenges to the mitigation of this problem. I mean, you just can't block 6,000 numbers from calling 911 at one time. By the time you figure out what's happened, there's no way to block them. And again, 911 only phones. There's no registration of them. Nobody knows they're still active. It's like getting hit from 6,000 points that you didn't know existed. There is a method to blocking the phones, but it involves a direct connection to the carrier and blocking the IMEI numbers, which gets into a whole mess that a lot of carriers don't want to do. Because at that point, you've now legally blocked somebody's ability to call for help. So there's no real quick, simple answer to stopping this. And the concern that came up in a lot of the research that I found was that what's going to happen when this happens on a much larger scale than just Dallas? What happens when somebody calls for a car wreck in Morgantown, but they're put on hold for an hour because of an attack going on in Florida? And it continues to cascade. The system doesn't stop. There's no termination point. It'll cascade to the point where everything in network is full. The ensuing chaos, as previously mentioned, lines quickly become clogged and they stop legitimate calls from coming in. It doesn't stop the ability for services to communicate with each other. So if you called your buddy who's a cop who radioed to somebody else, it's not going to affect that. But it is going to affect the ability for alarm companies to notify police departments that there's a bank alarm going off, that your house alarm's going off, that your house is on fire, that the smoke detector's going off. And there's no warning system that says this type of attack is going on, unless you're tuned in with your local emergency management, which puts out on social media that they're unable to receive calls. There's no notification. I know that was kind of quick. I wanted to try to kind of speed it up since we had some technical difficulties earlier. So, do you guys have any questions? I know that's kind of a strange view on it, but it's... Yeah.
How do you see that changing with a lot of the regional 911 systems and the E911 coming through? Voice-based technology. That's going to be a unique challenge. I'm not real sure how to answer that because it's going to be a unique challenge. One of the other challenges is that if you clog up voice, they're allowing now text to 911. What's going to happen when now all you do is spam it? Now you've killed another mode of communication. So, in terms of VoIP technology, the VoIP technology, a lot of the systems are not upgrading to keep up with the new technologies. I know our local one at home is still, they're 2 years out from being able to identify VoIP calls. When I say that, they're reliant on the address that's provided in the registration for MagicJack or for whatever VoIP line it is. So, yeah, they're heavily reliant on that. So I don't know when they're going to be able to upgrade the system to deal with challenges like that. Because it costs a lot of money and there's not a lot of money available for the upgrades. Does that answer your question? Or okay. Yeah.
Whenever someone dials in 911, does it automatically transmit the IMEI so they can identify a handset or not?
It depends. Again, that goes back to the technologies available at the center. So when you dial 911 from a cell phone, it goes through two phases. Phase one, your cell phone goes to the closest tower, and the closest tower calls the closest 911 center. So that's how, and a lot of times if you're traveling, you could call 911 in the middle of Charleston, and depending on what cell tower you're hitting, you get a 911 center in Beckley. Now that's a little far-fetched, but in our phase two, the center, when it receives the call, actually has to initiate a request for the data. So they actually request your information from the tower, which requests from the phone GPS coordinates and further identification. But no, the IMEI does not pop up. It actually comes up as a phone number. That's why 911 only phones are a challenge, because it doesn't pop up with a number, it just says incoming call.
How would they identify handsets that are not registered on any carrier whatsoever?
It just comes in as a either unknown number or just incoming call. Yeah.
In your opinion, what's the best way to avoid a DDoS?
With this, I don't really have a good answer, because the system is fragile and it's so intertwined that you would have to have legislation changes that allow for centers to immediately block repeat calls. But then that puts liability on the center for stopping the ability to call for help. So it would have to be a legislation change to be able to put the ability in the centers to, when they have the same number call 15 times in 10 minutes, they say, okay, this is an attack, this is a bug, we're going to have to stop this, block the call for even 30 minutes. Kind of bring reprieve and allow legitimate calls to come in. Yeah?
If you see an attack happening, say a terrorist attack, a corporation with DDoSing the phones, DDoSing the hospitals,
yeah.
IV pumps, could you see a coordinated attack or something like that coming from, say, a nation state or something like that all happening at once? And how would we ever even, we should just go to bed and cover our heads at night, or is this something that we could look into having more legislation on that kind of thing for backups?
To answer the first part of your question, it is the first prong in a concern. I would definitely say it's a possibility. I would say that I don't think that that's a pretty brazen move.
Well, cell phones get clogged anyway in the case of emergency. We've seen that on 911.
Yes.
We've seen it in different attacks that have
yes.
happened where cell phones are, pretty much inoperable.
But that was kind of my point too, with mentioning the sirens going off in Houston. If you couple a attack like that where you clog the ability to call for help and all of a sudden set off the alert system for an emergency, you're going to cause panic. And as you've seen, as you've mentioned, when you have a state of panic like that, there's no controlling what happens. There's no way to get out to people. There's no way to take legitimate calls. And at that point, all you have to do is follow up with misinformation through Twitter, through any other social platform, and you've effectively mitigated the ability for any information to get out. So, what was the other part of your question?
You answered.
Yes.
Is this? I was reading something a few months ago on this. Actually, it came up in Twitter conversation, but if I'm not mistaken, I wanted to see if it's the same thing that you can even use VoIP phones.
Yes.
Like Cisco put malware on the phones and make the phones do that. You can use that as well.
Yeah, it's the same exact concept. I chose to do this one on cell phones simply because there have been proven cases of this happening.
So you don't need to take 6,000 cell phones. You can hack into one building that's got 6,000 phones in it and do the same thing.
Yeah, at that point, well, it depends on how that's also gateway too, because you could have the same number coming out.
Wow.
So yeah, that was kind of the point, is that you can, It's terrifying to think that you can shut down the ability to call for help, alarms, anything that most security systems, most corporate security systems ring into a central office, a central security office, which they pick up the phone and they call the police. Or they pick up the phone and they call down and say, hey, what's going on? Why is this alarm going off? Or they see somebody breaking in. What are they going to do? They're going to call the 911 center and they're going to have them send the police. Well, that's all well and good till you either get a busy signal or it says, please hold. And by that point in stage, they've already moved in. And in 35 minutes, a lot of criminals can clean out a lot of places, yes.
What happens with the non-emergency police number? Say you get a busy signal with 911. You say, all right, I'll try the non-emergency.
Yeah. The non-emergency on the 911 center will fill up. That's one thing I originally was not aware of, that when the 911 lines fill up, it will actually roll over to the non-emergency lines. So they will fill up also. Now, they will only ring busy because they're non-emergency lines. But as for non-emergency number to like actual departments, no, they will be unaffected.
So if you found a department number,
yes,
then you have a chance of getting through.
Yeah, if you called Charleston City Police Department directly versus the county 911 center, yes, you would get through to them.
If there's somebody named.
Yeah, and that's another thing, is that a lot of departments have cut back. They've only got one person answering the phone. If a lot of people get that idea, go back to the old days of I'll just call them directly, and then they get overwhelmed. Of course, that's only one line. It's not going to go to hold. It's not going to, so, yeah.
So I have actually had on my phone, the same sort of text that you get for an Amber Alert or something like that. I've had my county send out, hey, we are unable to receive 911 calls. Call this number.
Yes. That is one move that they're trying to do to mitigate that, but that wouldn't work in a super high volume situation. Whereas if you created panic again, I go back to the sirens going across the city. If that happens and you have 6,000 people try to call those numbers, you're going to effectively shut down your ability to receive those calls. But that is one short-term fix.
Well, and going back to the sirens, can you also send out a text that says, our sirens are malfunctioning?
Yes.
Please ignore them.
That's what they ended up doing. But for the first 20, 25 minutes, even the city officials that had the ability to put that message out. Because the mass communications, especially in the emergency world, are so tightly controlled that it takes one person, or it takes the approval of 2 or 3 people and one person to actually punch the message in to send it out. They actually ran into this. It's funny you mentioned that. I was just reading a story in California with the wildfires. The emergency center actually decided against blasting an entire county with a text message about the wildfires encroaching one neighborhood. They ended up losing 10 people because they were so afraid to blast the whole county that hey, we have wildfires encroaching this area. We can't control them. You need to evacuate. They elected not to send that in favor of we didn't want to cause panic. Yeah.
Some jurisdictions segment mobile emergency traffic and then have whitelisted landlines in the area for prioritization.
In some of the bigger cities, possibly. I have not, again, sometimes that's very sensitive material. They won't exactly let out. But I know in the smaller jurisdictions, such as Charleston, Morgantown.
That would go for the county then, technically.
Yeah. They do not. Again, their systems, I know some of the systems that still operate on sometimes it takes them calling a carrier for them to be able to ping a phone to find out its GPS coordinates even when they call 911. There have been times that somebody will call in and say, I don't know where I'm at, I need help. They'll hit phase 2 on the console and it'll tell them, you don't have permission. They actually have to call the carrier while the person's on the line on their emergency number and have them ping the phone and give them GPS coordinates. So there's a lot of systems a lot of legacy systems that aren't prepared for stuff like that.
Also, Kanawha County actually has an app
They do.
You know, they report everything on their feed all the way down to there was a traffic accident on this street.
Yeah.
Everything.
Again, that's another technique. It's starting to roll out, but they're ahead of the curve. There are tons of systems that aren't even remotely ready for that. I know some centers in this state that still run XP on their primary machines.
I know at least one county that still uses City Radio.
What was that?
Citizens Band Radio. Boone County, King, huge example.
So you look at technology like that, and then you see things like, yes, whitelisting would be effective, but it's not. You have systems that you could very quickly overwhelm. And again, by the time that when centers outside of the initial impact zone start getting these calls, they don't know any different. They just think that something happened and they're answering the calls before they realize what's going on. Anything else? All right, guys, thanks for putting up with me for a few minutes.